time, because we don't have a lot of time in this small gap between now and when studio starts, I want to get started while people are sitting down. That's fine. I'm also not going to do an extensive introduction because these are talks that are within the school, and you should understand, you should know the people involved. But I do want to say a couple things about Nana, because I will say my first exposure to Nana
I was worried about what you
was a little negative. Now, I'll explain why. I arrived at MIT.
I get to do one back.
I arrived at MIT. You were already in your second year or third year.
No, second year.
Second year. And we had to sign up for office hours with the advisor who had to sign off our cards, our schedules, essentially. So I go to sign up, and there's written last. And I thought, wait a second, you can't determine that that's the last appointment. You know, that's really unfair. And so I crossed it out, and I wrote my name next to it. I met Nana soon afterwards. So I'm mad? No, you weren't mad. I was mad at you. That changed. So I've known Nana for a while and have admired her. I've always thought, actually, I'm a fairly rational human being, but I'm far out rationalized by Nana, who has a background. She has a BA from Carnegie Mellon in philosophy and art criticism. Then she got her architecture degree from the GSD and her PhD from MIT, where she worked on her dissertation on Wittgenstein, which you can see turned into her book published in 2008, Wittgenstein's House. She's now working on a new book on When Art Meets Architecture, but she has bravely volunteered to be the first of our insider trading series. And
I thought I was the third. They kept
whoops.
going
The schedule kept changing on her. I have asked these brave people who are doing this to essentially offer us works in progress. These aren't meant to be formal talks, but they're really meant to be a chance for us to see work in progress and to engage with someone. And I think this is also an opportunity to congratulate Nana on her new job at UVA, though we'll be sorry to be losing her and not having her around. For me, I will say in particular, I'm sorry to see you moving to Charlottesville, but I look forward to hearing more about you and from you from there. So, all yours.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and everybody coming today. This really is a work in progress. I'll get to this particular paper in a second. I was just going to tell you a little about other things I've worked on, and because it's short and because I'm not working on them currently, I'm giving you the very brief summaries. This is indeed a book that came out about a year and a half ago, and I think the two-sentence version, maybe it's even just one-sentence version, is that it looks at Wittgenstein, who was a philosopher known for having an early and late phase of his work in the philosophy of language, and it essentially looks how, in the period in between when he built this house for his sister in Vienna, how that affected his work, and so how it moved his work and essentially spatialized his understanding of language. That was the summary. The next little set of projects I was going to show you a couple images from. This is an image from 1978 of New York by the artist Thomas Struth, known for doing photography and particularly an architectural set, although there are other ones as well. And I have a series of projects that I'm working on sort of with him or near him. One is a fairly short book on the relationship of architecture and photography, which isn't so much with him, that's with people in Edinburgh, but another book that I'm working on that looks at interrelationships between these sets of photographs he's taken that form 4 different series. This one's the sort of streetscapes. There's a set that are portraits, there's a set that are museums, and there's a set that are landscapes, and then there's some new work coming out right now. I need apparently to speak up a little bit more. And then the final thing, which is getting to the paper that I'm giving today, is a book that I've been working on called When Art Meets Architecture, and it has essentially 5 different parts that look at that interrelationship as it's developed, mostly since the 90s. And it has parts like appropriation and representation and inhabitation and urban imagery. And then this last part, which this essay started out as part of, but it's taken on a life of its own. So what I'm speaking today is on the topic of fluidity or flow. And I'm just showing some images that, both because I am just starting, well, I haven't just sort of starting formalizing this. There's a lot that's going on. As I said, it sort of took on a life of its own. It's become much longer. So I'm greatly summarizing some bits of things here. I'm not getting to most of the examples, and it is indeed a work in progress. So hopefully, that said, you'll begin to at least see how I'm trying to lay out a set of issues and what the problems are. And the images are more or less, some of them are illustrations, some of them are just sort of for your amusement. Okay, fluidity. An ever-increasing number and variety of architectural projects have come to be associated with the concept of flow. Invoked at every level, from genetic and molecular to wide-scale socioeconomic processes, material logics, and natural formations, flow is at once deemed formal, material, operational, environmental, and experiential. It is seen to arise in various structures, formations, and systems, ranging from building systems to climatic and environmental ones, to money, goods, energy, water, and land masses. The concept appears in projects based upon or otherwise producing everything from buildings to clouds to icebergs to monsters to environments and climates. The standard dictionary definitions of flow define it as a steady or continuous stream of something, or as a being swept along according to some set of forces. And really, one of my big concerns are exactly what are those forces. In architecture and elsewhere, flow is described in opposition to rationalized, idealized, traditional, or stable forms. It is seen to produce non-stable geometries that are difficult, if not impossible, to pin down or solidify. It is presented as that which overcomes various entrenched dichotomies, ranging from that between object and field to container and contained, and nature and culture. In economics and around discussions of capitalism, flow is invoked as a model pertaining to information, money, and trade. In psychology, flow is defined as an energized focus or the mental state of operation in which the person is fully immersed in what he or she is doing. The result is described as a single-minded immersion that harnesses the emotions in the service of performing and learning. In this view, the emotions are not just contained and channeled, but are positive, energized, and aligned with the task at hand. Where psychology has put forth this fairly well-defined understanding of flow, the specifics of architecture have resulted in a series of ambiguities in its use. To begin with, what is it that flows? Is it the material or the inhabitants that are flowing? Is it that which directs and structures space, or the space itself? Or is it the experience of the space? Do the materials form flows, or do they form channels or markers of flows? And what relation, if any, do these ambiguities bear to the construct itself? Several interesting problems emerge around these questions that enlighten not simply what flow might mean in or for architecture, but potential implications verging on what I think of as imperatives that emerge through flow's architectural deployment. To discuss this, I want to begin with an idea that first became apparent to me during an architecture review where the concept flow was being invoked around people, space, buildings, landforms, and so on. It occurred to me that outside of the architecture context, there were a number of important cases where flow's spatial or architectural application was presented, though not always proceeding as planned. Oh, let's go back. Not there yet. In his well-known Supreme Court ruling from 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes set the bottom line of freedom of speech in what is declared to be one of the court's most historic and enduring statements. Quote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. The question in every case is whether the words are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree." While Justice Holmes' proclamation made some 90 years ago may seem miles away from an architectural declaration, allusions to and reliance upon a view of architectural space provide the basis of the functioning of his example. More so, the particular reference is very relevant to strains of current practice that are based upon or emphasize flow. As presented by Holmes, the principle of clear and present danger became one of the rare justifications for the restraint of free speech, something typically only limited in the 20th century when speech is seen to cross the line and become conduct or action. In this case, the limitation on free speech was employed to deny the petition of John Schenck, who had been arrested for distributing pamphlets arguing against the legality of the draft during the First World War. What is not generally seen, however, is the Schenck's decision's fundamental reliance on spatial and architectural underpinnings and their relation to human action, which is to say that the ruling explicitly ties together space, speech, action, and, as I will discuss shortly, agency. In relation to architecture, Holmes's model functions in a twofold manner. In the first way, the statement directly emanates from the issue of flow and a containment, directing, or delineation of space and conduct. In the second way, Holmes's statement pertains to concomitant relations between speech and action. Implicit in the legal opinion are a set of assumptions about the spatial ordering of the theater and its interface with human behaviors and actions, the relation between people and the environment, and the manner in which the spatial environment influences and disrupts behavior, including self-determined behavior and free speech. What Holmes's example brings to the fore for architecture are constructions that have at times been buried and at other times collapsed within strains of architecture practice, particularly distinctions between the design or understanding of architecture as a physical form and material presence on the one hand, and architecture as a container and director of space and action on the other. Flow's ability to invoke space, experience, form, and operations at once amplifies these relations. Furthermore, flow is not only able to produce such variety of attributes, but it is also able to absorb or incorporate them as well. This becomes apparent in two strategies or processes repeatedly appearing in or underlying architecture practices that develop flow. The first involves the importation of outside models, frequently from nature and the sciences, while the second involves the dismantling of traditionally defining dichotomies. Each of these processes mediates a set of relations via the architecture and the design process. The concerns in both cases emanate from flow's potential to join different territories or forms by, in the first instance, incorporating models from outside disciplines into architecture. And here I'm particularly interested in how architectural constructs of flow bring together social models with models from the physical, natural, and biological, as well as informational sciences. And in the second instance, the joining of territories relates to a set of dichotomies that flow's operations are seen to activate and dismantle. Through these methods, the construct of flow aspires to the joint development of order, something further complicated when codes of growth such as DNA and generative algorithms are enlisted to produce organization from within. Questions abound, though, when such generative processes are transplanted from one discipline into another. What, for example, do the embedded processes organize or structure? Additionally, the various models of growth developed from the natural and other sciences that are typically employed, including things from biology, ecology, and geology, as well as systems theory, all harbor within themselves complex dialogues between physical processes and social ones. It is such dialogues that ensue within architecture, which, when brought out into the open, provide a basis of architecture's critical relations within society, something I believe that necessarily emerges, but to too great an extent is ignored with the construct of flow. While architecture is traditionally seen as that which is coincident with containment, inhabitation, and the delineation of space, flow has the potential to disrupt established hierarchies. The dismantling of dichotomies occurs as flow engenders to connect components of architectural space, its formation, ordering, occupation, and experience. In this repositioning, architecture, while traditionally understood to operate in the lead organizational or structuring role, oscillates between being a container and being contained, and from the role of director of space and operations to being directed and operated. Reiser and Umamoto, for example, in their Atlas of Novel Tectonics, point to a number of dichotomies traditionally germane to the definition of architecture, including that between container and contained, or object and field, both of which they find flow dismantles. Yet, while they employ flow to subvert this set of dichotomies, they adamantly uphold other associated ones, including that between the real and the metaphorical or representational. Similarly, other practices that invoke Similarly, other practices that invoke flow insist on maintaining sharp distinctions by contending that architecture is and needs to be engaged in real material flows and not what are deemed to be representations of them. Dichotomous structures or constructs, when upheld, seemingly oppose the thrust of flow by locating, delimiting, and containing architecture to certain clear compartments, at times hiding or suppressing inherent contradictions, which unleashed would potentially make it unclear how architecture functioned. The result of such an unleashing is to mix materiality with form on the one hand, and materiality and behavior on the other, and materiality with representation on the third. This happens with flow and becomes apparent in several forms, including the current preoccupation with new forms of mass production, hybrid categories, and monsters. And I had a whole sort of intro to monsters here that I don't think I have time to sort of set up, but ending with a really great quote from Derrida. But I'll skip that for the moment, and obviously there's a set of projects that go with that. Beyond rethinking architectural dichotomies, projects based on flow have the potential to engage issues invoked as active components of architectural development in a way that allows for more than the advancing of how to produce architecture, but sets the stage for architecture to enter into a set of broader constructs or issues as well. This next section is called Spatial Formations. I want to return now to the Schenk's decision for another set of issues that it raises. The opinion was rendered during the same period in which the rise of the masses and mass culture began to be theorized in terms of their spatial, aesthetic, technological, socio-political, and psychological implications. Holmes's issuance can itself be seen as codifying and responding to the development of the masses and defining a moment of interaction between the individuals, the masses, and a socio-spatial system. It is just such junctures or concurrences that appear in writings of the critical theory discourse that developed in the first decades of the 20th century, including Georg Lukács's discussion in his History and Class Consciousness, written 3 years after the Schenck decision, and Siegfried Krakauer's coining of the term the mass ornament in his same titled essay of 1927. I want to consider such spatial formations in relation to ones arising under late capitalism, particularly to those stemming from issues of flow and newly developing formalisms. Importantly, there's been a late 20th century resurgence in redefining the masses within theory, as evidenced by Hart and Negri's Multitude, in which they posited an emerging form of collectivity in which both various groups and individuals can combine in fluid matrices of resistance that defy the silence of the masses. Of interest as well, I would add, is the rise since the 1990s of what I've written about elsewhere as aesthetic practices of accumulation. In his Mass Ornament, Krakauer offers a reading of modernism's newly developing spatial formations and their relation to subjectivity and capitalism. The essay revolves around the example of a precision dance group as Krakauer's primary and most succinct example of what he terms the mass ornament. Of particular note in Krakauer's description is the disjunction he finds between the spatial formations the group produces with their bodies and the subjectivity and agency of the individual dancers. These products, this is a quote, "These products of American distraction factories are no longer individual girls, but indissoluble female units whose movements are mathematical demonstrations. Even as they crystallize into patterns in the reviews in Berlin, performances of the same geometrical exactitude are occurring in similarly packed stadiums in Australia and India, not to mention America. One glance at the screen reveals that the ornaments consist of thousands of bodies, sexless bodies in bathing suits. The regularity of their pattern is acclaimed by the masses who themselves are arranged row upon ordered row." While Krakauer differentiates the group's formations from ones that involve an intersubjective consciousness, he repeatedly posits that responsibility remains with the viewer. Here's another quote. "Similarly, actors are not aware of the stage setting in its totality, yet they consciously take part in its formation. Yet this does not mean that it is observed by a more critical eye. The fact is that nobody would notice the pattern if the crowd of spectators who have an aesthetic relation to it do not represent anyone were not sitting in front of it." Krakauer's example of the audience points to instances of the masked ornament with which we all repeatedly, if unknowingly, engage and enact. The audience proves crucial in a number of ways. First, by calling attention to the stage action Then importantly, the audience enacts the mass ornament themselves as, in Krakauer's words, its true bearers. Crucial to the efficacy of Krakauer's analysis is the mirroring of the dance group in the audience's own organization into the row upon ordered row that readily emerges as the unseen but not untheorized image behind Holmes's opinion rendered several years earlier in Schenck. While with Krakauer, those spatial images of the mass ornament are rationalized, geometrical, and incapable of spilling out beyond their bounds. Krakauer notes something profoundly inhuman in all of this, notably that the thinking behind the mass ornament, that of capitalist rationality, is nothing human but leaves out humans entirely, subsuming them into a formal complex of moving units synonymous with their spatial containers. This is repeated in various formal organizations, including the architectural rows and aisles that lead in and out of the collective space that defines and contains the viewers by transforming them into an audience. Krakauer likens the dancers' moves, or mass bodily formations, to aerial photographs of landscapes and cities that organize individuals in society rather than some internal organization manifesting agency. This distinction is important as it leaves the masses structured conforming to rather than productive of some organization. Quote, even though the masses bring it about, they do not participate in conceiving the ornament. In this, it resembles the aerial photographs of landscapes and cities, for it does not emerge from the interior of a given reality, but rather appears above it, end quote. Krakauer's discussion of the mass ornament as a sign of the workings of capitalism becomes particularly cogent in light of his understanding of it as a large-scale spatial image that is encountered in moments throughout society and is indicative of the functioning of that society. Krakauer's example is aimed at making the external structuring of the human and the obliteration under capitalism apparent. Despite his contention that this spatial imagery is synonymous with subjectivity under capitalism, it remains open as to what produces the ordering. The question recalls Adam Smith's abiding image of capitalism's free market optimization. Written in the same year as the Declaration of Independence, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations puts forth Smith's well-known image that summarizes capitalism's optimal functioning. This is a quote, "The individual generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good to be done by those who affected to trade for the public good," end quote. Yet again, not unlike the Schenck decision, Smith's metonymic metaphor raises a fundamental spatial and linguistic question. The invisible leading hand is a spatial structure that Smith employs to show how the workings of capitalism are organized at once from without and within, making it impossible to locate the hand. From where does it emanate? How does it guide? The image suggests what was then a set of newly emerging relations amongst individuals appearing as seemingly discrete acting capitalist agents. Although Adam Smith's quote describes the working of capitalism as the product of individual self-organization, something somewhat suggestive of flow, that assumption also comes into question as the hand, in its workings, at once produces and usurps agency, an issue central to the various confusions and concerns surrounding the concept of flow. Agency emerges around flow to ask what guides or produces it. In response, various architectural models of flow fill in this blank with imported models of growth, animated, environmental, economic, and informational ones, that take on or over the role of agency. Furthermore, the creation of agency underlies flow's relation to space, action, choice, and behavior, issues raised both in architecture design and in its reception. Against this, there are what I see as two predominant structures that develop to define flow: the commuting across what had been a defined set of boundaries of some sort, and the alignment with the task at hand or spatial container. Both of these bear relations to questions of agency. Through such images and orderings of Smith's invisible hand, Agency takes on variegated forms that generate distinct questions and responses. It is in and around the issue of agency, at least in part, that I want to consider how, for example, does structuring from above, mass ornament, the visible hand, so on, compare to architecture projects based on transplanted and embedded patterns of growth to determine and produce their internal structuring. What, for example, is our relation variously to those algorithms, material logics, production processes, genetic models, to essentially this set of rules? What is that relation? And what does it mean to use such systems to organize or structure human inhabitation? One way to consider relations between flow and agency is to think of them in light of the differences and similarities that appear between being guided and being in agreement. That is, relations between flow and agency may not be as much that between a physical or material practice and a social one, but as realized between these two associated terms. And because no paper of mine generally has no quotes from Wittgenstein, here's your Wittgenstein quote. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his Philosophical Investigations from 1953, discusses the following of a rule in relation to being guided, and against this offers a range of possibilities as to what that experience might be, especially in their implied manifestations of agency. So it's from section 172. Let us consider the experience of being guided and ask ourselves, what does this experience consist in when, for instance, our course is guided? Imagine the following cases. You are in a playing field with your eyes bandaged and somebody leads you by the hand, sometimes left, sometimes right. You have constantly to be ready for the tug of his hand, and you must also take care not to stumble when he gives an unexpected tug. Or again, someone leads you by the hand where you are unwilling to go by force. Or you are guided by a partner in a dance. You make yourself as receptive as possible in order to guess his intention and obey the slightest pressure. Or someone takes you for a walk. You are having a conversation, you go wherever he goes. Or you walk along a field track, simply following it. Agency emerges as well in direct correlation, perhaps even contrast, to the issue of flow in the Schenck decision. This juncture is where Holmes's statement in its concerns becomes most cogent and enduring for architecture practice. For it is at the seat of Holmes's thinking is the image of an ordered mass audience who, upon hearing the call fire, do not necessarily proceed to flow smoothly and orderly out of the rows upon rows of seating and into the awaiting aisles in accordance with either an implied diagram or potential tug of the hand. Instead, they potentially proceed at great cost to erupt in all directions, perhaps stomping over others or crushing others on the way. But I'm not predominantly speaking here of a model gone awry. Rather, I think the illusion goes more deeply into the makings of the model than into those situations in which it ceases to hold. And I mean here to include not just the architectural space imagined as a prop for the decision, but to take the issue at stake in Holmes's decision, that of the limits of free speech and its association to both action and to the space of action, as crucial. That is, to point to how the basis of the decision is tethered to the distinctions drawn between speech and action, stage and audience, and space and its delineation. Harnessing these concerns, distinctions, and interactions as aesthetic material are the following passages from Tom Stoppard's 1967 play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. The section succinctly mobilizes idea of free speech, action, relations between external controls or environment, order, agency, response, and the possibility for self-determination and awareness, and couples them with relations between the stage and the audience. All of these, I think, are constructs that are consequential to the discourse of flow. The setting for their scene is the disappearance from the stage, but all but the two titled characters. Rosencrantz. Perhaps they've trampled each other to death in the rush. Give them a shout, something provocative. Intrigue them. Guildenstern. Wheels have been set in motion and they have their own pace to which we are condemned. Each move is dictated by the previous one. That is the meaning of order. If we start being arbitrary, it'll just be a shambles. At least, let us hope so, because if we haven't, just happened to discover or even suspect that our spontaneity was part of their order, we'd know that we were lost. He's 6. A Chinaman of the Tang Dynasty, and by which definition a philosopher, dreamed he was a butterfly, and from that moment he was never quite sure that he was not a butterfly dreaming it was a Chinese philosopher. Envy him in his twofold security. A good cause. Rosencrantz leaps up and bellows at the audience, "Fire!" Guildenstern jumps up, "Where?" Rosencrantz, "It's all right. I'm demonstrating the misuse of free speech to prove that it exists." He regards the audience, that is the direction, with contempt, and other directions then front again. Not a move. They should burn to death in their shoes. And I read this and I always think, is he demonstrating that the misuse of free speech exists, that free speech exists? Plus, I just love the idea that we're really in trouble if we find out or suspect that our spontaneity is part of their order. Okay. Here, Stoppard furthers the underlying relations between speech and action in Holmes's decision by insinuating into it the relation between performers and audience, thereby adding to the complexity of interrelations between protected speech and restricted action. Interestingly, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern can in fact be seen to shout "fire" falsely in a crowded theater. And while J.L. Austin declared such onstage proclamations as a form of infelicitous speech, Rosencrantz really does yell "fire," and the audience is in position to doubt, at least temporarily, and that is all part of the speech's effect. Now, along with the Schenk's decision underlying reliance on flow in architectural space, one of the hallmarks of it and other free speech decisions is the distinction drawn between speech on the one hand and conduct or action on the other. What I see the Schenk decision accomplish is to tacitly but fundamentally add space to the speech-action duality. Transforming the dichotomy into a trilogy denies the bipolar stance of the speech-action distinction as it places it in a play with a third term, space, in which the first terms operate and interact. Speech and action thereby becomes situated. The distinction between speech and action bears relation as well to the set of distinctions within architecture, most notably here to that between architecture's complex role as physical form and its role as a form of activity, or to that between flowing and defining flows. What I am pointing to emerging from this understanding of flow as a form of alignment and interface that I think bears particularly interesting relation to architecture. And I think that architecture, as well as art, has the potential to play a very important role in flow's broader discussion as a particular kind of socio-spatial formation. What I want to suggest is that flow operates to produce a fundamentally architecture, language, physical, social interface and alignment. Focusing on such concepts as guiding agency or order takes fluidity away from being a set of formal or material structures, operations, or specific dichotomies. Instead, it demands the interface between physical and social models, while necessitating that formal aspects play a critical role, thereby allotting a potentially unique place for visual and spatial practice. This can be seen, for example, in that flow, while frequently defined as a material and formal process, manifests various social functionings and orders. What, one could ask, is the social purpose of flow, or of smooth functioning? What I want to get at is that flow can be seen as behaving, that is, acting in accord or alignment with certain practices or principles, some of which are manifest and others which are covered over or blanketed. Our society, for example, privileges usefulness and functionality as unquestioned and unquestionably rational constructs. What this does is suggest that use itself is a construct without history and in need of neither validation, mediation, nor explanation. This pervasive privileging of function operates by instituting a criteria for judgment, utility, that seems unquestionable as though it provided the one criterion in need of fulfillment. Smith's invisible hand, for example, is an instance of a smoothing over of both agency and the plurality of views from within the field of significance. Entering this is the underlying complex status of flow that questions whether it is socially defined smooth functioning or are acting in accord with it, which is at stake. Flow's emphasis on smoothness suggests a socially defined smooth functioning that is borne out by Holmes as upset when the limits of free speech are surpassed. Flow in this light emerges as a controlled delineation, itself masked by the seeming smoothness of the space and projected associated behavior. This recalls psychology's characterization of flow as not just containing and channeling emotions, but aligning them with the task at hand. It also suggests a concept that recognizes our identity as one of the masses in their numbers and potential for individual agency that require ordering. If flow is approached as a method of interaction or interface, it raises issues of the formal connection of relations between behavior, action, rules, and their formal manifestations. Surfacing thus through the spatial dichotomies around flow is the question of form itself. This brings me to the last topic that I want to throw into this mix, that of formalism, something typically associated with aesthetic practices. Now I'm going to give you this sort of 3/4 page summary of something that is beyond enormous. That said, I'm going to highlight the little parts that I want you to get out of it for this talk, and I'm including this part here not because it's crucial to this talk, but I think it's crucial to laying out the sort of breadth and possible historical context of some of these issues. Philosophy has frequently assigned to aesthetics and aesthetic practice a unique mediating role. In the second section on reification and consciousness of the proletariat in his History and Class Consciousness, Lukács considers the antinomies of bourgeois thought. He sees these contradictions arise in modern critical philosophy, beginning with Kant and the attempt to universalize and compartmentalize the world into a formal system of rationalism that refuses, quote, to accept the world as something that has risen or has been created by God independently of the knowing subject and prefers to conceive of it instead as its own product, end quote. This, Lukács notes, alienates the subject from the object and thereby produces a reified structure of consciousness. Such alienation is nowhere more apparent for Lukács than in Kant's concept of the thing in itself, which is, by definition, unknowable as it lies outside of the conceptual framework of rational systems. For Lukács, the crisis for this philosophical system emerges full force in Kant's discussion of the antinomies of pure reason in his Critique of Pure Reason, which sort of dates to the time of Smith, which is, in this case, this book was 1781. And I'll just note that the antinomies of pure reason are fascinating for developing all these issues, because what they really are about is there's 4 of them, and there's a set of things about the containment and limitations of space, the limits of causality, the limits of order and freedom, and the question of the existence or of a necessary being or first mover. So I think those concepts are interesting as being laid out there. Now, while these issues develop in Kant's epistemology and metaphysics, and Lukács goes through them piece by piece, Lukács finds that Kant ultimately turns to aesthetics as developed in his Critique of Judgment from 1790, and that's the point I want to get to. And the point is he suggests that he turns to aesthetics to perfect the system. Now, it's there that Lukács sees Kant assigned to art the role of mediator between otherwise irreconcilable opposites, something Lukács believes can only happen within this system to the extent that the content becomes aesthetic. And as one more aside, I'll just mention that Kant's known for developing a formalist system of aesthetics. Now, while for Lukács, Kant's realm of the aesthetic thus ends up only providing yet another domain for the fragmented self, something that Lukács finds can only be really dealt with through the construct of history, I think his discussion nonetheless ties together this set of really important and relevant issues. Now, what I want to do with this is to suggest that flow can be understood as supporting a kind of formalism, one emerging at the interface between what had been previously divided in traditional formalisms, that is, including relations between disciplines, mediums, and content. And raising these issues requires the remaking of form and formalism around boundary conditions that necessarily go beyond medium and disciplinary-based distinctions and their concomitant repression or exiling of content from form. Now, as I've described elsewhere, new formalisms are emerging in aesthetic practices that are not founded on distinctions and exclusions, but developed through inclusion and association. I see this as related to the repeated hope or goal of aesthetics to play a mediating role in broader epistemological and social issues. For example, flow frequently emerges in the transfer of processes developed in one material or practice into another, a process I think itself that forestalls flow and subsequent formalisms from being defined by the medium or discipline. Importantly, traditional formalisms, in their view of content as contamination, institute categorical dismissals that are not unique to art and architecture, but represent a much wider social strategy. The constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe has described legal formal systems or formal legal decisions, such as those made between speech and conduct, as regularly being employed by the courts. And a quote here, when the background relationships of power come to the foreground, as they do, for example, in labor picketing cases, courts often resort to formalism to conceal what might be viewed as a frank preference for one set of interests over another, or at least as a substantive choice of one constitutional vision over another. By resolving these cases through categorization rather than analysis of the function that the expressive activity performs in each setting, courts have ignored the inequalities of access to communications media that prevail as much in the economic as in the political arena, end quote. Such distinctions, Tribe notes, frequently ignore or cover over the evaluation of actual free speech and property interests involved by invoking formal distinctions to provide a neutral facade, and one that masks the issues behind it. This brings us back to the smooth, potentially neutral facades at times presented by flow. My concern is that flow, in its very smoothness, and it is potentially, and in its absorption of dichotomies and conflicting positions, has at one extreme the potential to do something similar to formal legal decisions. The problem then that ensues when flow is viewed as form is that it has the potential to cover over issues. But I think this is best dealt with not by downplaying flow's strong formal aspects and implications, but by using flow to rethink formalism's functioning in the broadest way. I see flow as containing the potential to enact a formalism that involves incorporation rather than exclusion, and this allows flow to be seen as poised between these two models of what smooths over dichotomies, mediums, and other distinctions, yet when its social, cultural, linguistic, political, when all seemingly non-formal aspects are acknowledged in minds, it opens up new potentials to interact with wider spheres implied by and through its constructs and operations.
I have a question. That if I appreciate the combining of legal history, aesthetic history, social history, and architectural history into this question, and the sort of discovery that flow ends up being something that you can really see through modernism and today. One question would be, in terms of your last point, so you're essentially arguing that the let's say social political being foregrounded with the possibility of the formal being illustrative is okay.
Not being illustrative, more enacting, more even at the forefront, like pushing it. I don't want to, I'm actually very interested in the formal possibilities of this. I just am sort of against their separation.
Exactly, but I guess my question would be, how do you aid the formal from not becoming primary and becoming the reader of exactly what you were saying it does, that sort of obliterates the possibility of the social and political. In other words,
yeah.
Most of the stuff that you used as background illustrations, can it still be reinterpreted in a way that operates in your system?
No, I think actually some of it will divide. And I think when I do more of these and start talking about a lot of the specific projects, there'll be big divisions. And that I'll really have to go through the pieces of and see what that means. I mean, I definitely see some, I see a lot of potential, but I really have not done all that. I've done some of it on the artwork, and there's an essay on formalism that I do some of those aspects. But,
I guess my follow-up then would be, how would you teach?
but I think some are going to push. I think some of it is becoming cognizant and marking it and moving in and out of being pure material, moving into clearly being represented, moving back and forth between and involving that, so you're sort of forced to see aspects while still being involved in it. That's kind of the goal.
No, I think that's interesting and that makes sense. But my follow-up would be, how do you teach someone to look at works, to be able to see beyond putting all of those things in one category?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I feel like I've done it when I've looked at, say, if we go back to the first slide, Wittgenstein's house, which you could read as a formal modernist thing caught between being aristocratic and being fully modern. And in some ways, it is that, and that is the way it's traditionally written about. And yet I do feel like I've written about it a whole other way, which if we begin to talk in the world about architecture in another way, that is part of what people will see. So it goes to the education, it goes to broader discussions, and it's part of my appeal to other disciplines where they begin to see architecture that way, as invoking those and not limited, because I think so many see it as great but limited, right? I mean, outside of architecture school.
That was the depth of what you were doing, the richness of the sources and the attempts to bring them together are quite extraordinary and appreciated. You made a point at the beginning. You had an interior which I couldn't quite identify. It was a museum interior.
Oh, the Zaha, right?
Is that a Zaha project?
Yeah, the Zaha new
That.
the Zaha new contemporary art museum in Rome.
Yeah,
just opened.
I get them mixed up. Anyway, you
That's
asked
part of it, right?
You asked the question: is flow related to the people in the space? Is it related to the forms that are manipulating and forming the space, or is it the space itself? Which I think is a very, very kind of clear question, which you then dove into, beginning with the Supreme Court decision.
Which is, and I owe Chris a thank you for that, wherever Chris went to.
But what I would like to
It was
do
his studio.
is to come back to that question
Yeah.
and say...
That's what I have these little notes that I'm writing to myself at the end, which are beginning to get back to that.
Right, but because you touched on it in a couple of different ways with the mass ornament, in terms of talking about the people
Right.
as part of a flow. You talked about architecture in terms of the structuring of seats in a performance, right? So you sort of touched on it. I'm wondering if what you've done on the project to date has helped you isolate that question.
Yeah, no, it
with
has.
regard to those three
And I think
different possibilities.
I think part of the word is that it's not always the same, and I think there's going to be different models in some sense. But part of it, I think, has to do with alignment, and either where it crosses over sort of seamlessly or aligning with. And I think it's going to be about bringing where it can't be the separation, but that maybe there are projects that do try to separate, and I'm going to look at that and analyze. This is why it threatens to take over my life.
But I guess for some of us, the idea that form flows is in some ways preempting the fact that people flow, right?
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly.
That the real point of architecture projecting and supporting agency, activity, is not of mimicking a flow one wants to produce and formed, but of understanding of understanding that the importance is on the activity, and that you don't preempt the activity with the shapes that are surrounding the activity, right? And that's the sort of simple critique of the confusion that comes between seeing form as material and form as activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big, huge range of these possibilities, which is truly why I like the Wittgenstein quote of the sort of possibilities that you hadn't thought of, and the book, The Investigations, his book is so full of that, where it just says, no, we associate with this, but it's also that one as well, and these others, and you can go on. And I want to see whether that plays out in projects in different ways and whether it causes different things and whether different ways it creates it to be more critical. Because I'm very big on not rejecting the critical, and I've always been a kind of sort of trained formalist at heart. So I like the idea that one wouldn't have to exclude it. And I do think that there's a lot of art practices that have done this very successfully. And I really want to sit down and analyze. I mean, and certainly people like the Blur building tries to clearly, you know, but that's sort of at one extreme. And I want to begin to see whether other projects can take that on or do take it on. And if we can develop other ways of talking about it. Because I'm also very against, you know, knowledge being, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. You know, I'm much more into the cumulative model. Let's take from that, let's rethink it, let's add to it, let's incorporate it.
Right. I just gave you a dichotomy.
Yeah.
Right. Between the importance
Yeah.
of activity and the importance of
Right.
form, and your understanding of aesthetics as being exactly what dissolves that dichotomy.
Yeah. Yeah.
One is tempted to think it's space, right?
It's certainly one of them, and I think it has real potential and around that. And I think, you know, I think so much of how we see things and is based on what we've been taught and how we're told that, and that isn't in the background. And so we all have a kind of responsibility towards the potential to see it other ways, and I'm very big on pushing that potential.
I wonder what you do with certain kinds of architectural production that exist outside the definition of the fluid, which probably in a contemporary sense goes back maybe 20, 25 years, something like that, that you probably can cite some over there. It doesn't really matter too much. But outside the history of that production and outside the discussion surrounding that, there are two examples I'm thinking of. Ito's U House, which idiomatically looks similar. It looks like it's a kind of flow building, but is not participant in that. Or Emile Ayo's social housing projects at a much bigger scale outside Paris. Just kind of ribbons of
Yeah, I can't picture that, yeah.
or housing.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, I wonder how you would situate work like that, idiomatically similar, but outside
Yeah.
the discourse.
Yeah, I'm very big on, I mean, and what makes it, you know, I'm very big, like, where is that discourse set, right? The person that does it, I'm very big on ignoring what anybody says about almost anything, but certainly what they say about their work as defining it. So, I mean, just that you raise that question is really interesting, right? It enters into the discussion in some way. Does it create a new category? Does it prove itself to be outside? Do we reject it? I mean, it has some relation, and that interests me. You know, so which aspects make it part of this, which don't? Do you have to be fully in it to be part of it? There's a great sort of other set of things that I've been reading on the structure of categories, and it's all about how we construct these categories, and they're very central to building of how we think. But that ones are definitely privileged, and we understand those as you know, being the case, but then these others exist, and there's all these different structures of categorical formations. And so I'm sort of interested in and around questions like that. Like, it enters into, yes, it comes to your mind, you want to exclude it, why is that? Do we exclude it? Does it matter whether we call it that or not? No, and to me, when I write on contemporary people, it's always, you know, I never approach them because, you know, they'll read it, they'll say something or not, but, you know, that's not part of my, and it's very interesting to me now having a collaboration with an artist and actually another one, but mainly this project with Thomas Truth where he's just like, write whatever you want, but because he contacted me based on what I'd already written, which I never thought he'd like in the first place. So, you know, and now he's using it to sort of think about his own work. So more of a dialogue and not so much just together.
When do you bind your argument to the images? Because I know you do that sometimes very directly. And
well,
when do you completely, like, this is almost completely separate, right? There are a couple of
Yeah,
points you've made a brief point.
yeah, I mistimed the monsters. I was going to do Greg Lynn's Predator.
But
I did it in the wrong order.
The question is really, when do you decide to,
Yeah.
and is it a process that as the argument is developed, you get closer and closer to incorporating
Well, it started with these things.
the images?
Yeah.
So it's a process of starting with, but then you cut it off.
Well, it's like levels of development. I can only focus on so much at once. Well, it actually started with the word and me thinking, wait, people don't always flow like they're supposed to, and thinking of that decision. And that was several years ago. And then one day last fall, just thinking, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern has that scene in it, which is my just favorite. It has really a great other quote that I would have given you, but we didn't have enough time. But yeah, so they're sort of there. And so then I'll form this, and then I will go back and I will pull out things, and then I'll reform this in response to that.
But
I mean, I
does
won't
that
have the
process-
match.
Does that process start to tie the
Yeah,
images
yeah.
directly to the argument?
Some of it. I will look at, like I have lists of projects that I'm going to look at or investigate, and that always leads to more, and it always makes you change some things. So yeah, that's what I mean. This is, you know, probably 5 times that length, 4 times that length by the time I'm done.
There's also another interesting aspect to flow, which is the relation of architecture itself, which is architecture. You know, I'm curious if you were to extend the architecture, construct a parallel argument about architecture that imagines itself as kind of circulating in a wider field, where knowledges, practices, structural material technologies, and methods of transmission or density are related, but where circulation itself is conceptualized in a sense. So it's not so much about kind of circulation of style, but one where you take account of that kind of greater assemblage,
Yeah.
which is, you know, through which architecture moves. Because architecture, as you know, moves with the wind. In some ways, I see that as being very under thought actually when we think about global architecture.
Yeah.
Contemporarily, sort of.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's interesting. I have the sense that it's completely relevant to the topic, but that my focus is something else, right? And I'm not trying to be fully descriptive, so it's like I'll give you a footnote and say, Kurt's thought about this. No, but I mean, because it is, you know, right? And this is very much my collection, and certainly everybody that's taken my classes will recognize a bunch of things that I mention all the time, which I included, specifically chose those for all of you guys, so that they would feel familiar. But yeah, you know, there's a set of ideas that and I'm always very interested in the set of relationships between these things that are frequently too severed, and that we could have other possibilities for. That sort of, I think, in the end, downplay architecture and its ability to enter into other discussions. But the idea of it moving in that way is interesting.
So what's interesting is that in those discussions necessitated this revisiting of culture.
Yeah.
How we think about, I mean, words like culture, the public sphere, all of these kind of different social models. I find it interesting that, you know, this is actually quite central to your discussion on raising the flow as an issue. And agency.
Yeah.
I mean, agency has come up in a number of lectures recently where at least I think 2 lecturers despise the parametric precisely because of its the way that it positions agency, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't want to reject those things. I think there's
Right,
other
yeah,
possibilities that one can do with them, that they offer something that's not fully at least being brought out.
Right.
What's interesting about watching a project that's this much in progress is that I think you've hit on an incredibly rich topic, and you've completely convinced us all that this is, you know, this is a topic that we should all be thinking about. I think I'm eager, even though I favor the one-word titles, and I was really happy that you had a one-word title. I'm looking forward to the subtitle of it.
Yeah.
Because I think you recognize that it's so big, but you clearly have a very, you know, your own understanding of where that subtitle is going. So it's
Yeah, but I probably gave you the one word because I had all different subtitles that I couldn't choose between.
Well, I don't think it's the right moment to have
Yeah.
that subtitle pinned down, but I think it's clear that it's coming into focus. But
That's
thank you
okay.
very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.